Hello, welcome to this webinar. I'm Francis Sealey from GlobalNet21, and this is one of the regular webinars we do where we discuss some issues that affect us locally, nationally, and globally. And a few weeks ago, we did a meeting on artificial intelligence and the future of work. Becky Faith was going to join us, but she was unfortunately ill then, and she's kindly agreed to do a webinar with us because her perspective was particularly interesting. She was going to look at the ethics that surround the whole area of artificial intelligence and big data. So we've got Becky with us today, who you'll see in a minute. And we've got David Wood as well, who we did the meeting with. David runs the London Futurists group, which is a fantastic group and always gets really, really good turnouts. Now, before I go to them, let me say, if you're on the webinar site, you can put your questions and your comments in the webinar chat box on the right. And if you're watching us on the stream on Facebook, you can add comments under the stream and we'll try and pick them up. And we'll put those questions to Becky as we go along. Anyhow, Becky, thank you very much for joining us. Maybe we could start by you telling us just a little bit about yourself and your own research.
So my name is Dr. Becky Faith, and I co-lead the Digital and Technology Research Group at the UK's Institute of Development Studies, which is at the University of Sussex down here on the rather blustery south coast of England. And our critical interest, and my particular interest, is in what we call digital inequalities. And so that's looking at the differential impact of digital technologies on different groups in society. And my research has looked at both this issue in the UK and with a more global perspective. So my doctoral research looked at how low income and homeless women in the UK were using smartphones and what impact that was having on their lives. And so we're really interested in issues of digital exclusion. And this affects people in their working lives, it affects people in their political lives and their ability to engage with political debates online and so on and so forth. And it also affects their kind of sense of political agency. So I think one of the interesting issues for us globally now, obviously, is the whole issue around digital interference in our democratic systems, as we've seen with the Cambridge Analytica scandals, and our sense of digital capacity and our ability to express ourselves online, our ability to tell fake news from truth online really affects how we live nowadays and our ability to be active citizens.
Okay.
So kind of issues we work on.
Okay, I mean, you're talking about technological change, but we've faced all this before, and it's impacted on our working lives before. Is it different this time? And if it is, how is it different?
So I think we've been through technological change. I mean, the Industrial Revolution was a huge technological change. The Luddites were a product of technological change. I think this time, and so I think one of the mistakes that I think people make is to say this time is totally different, that societies have never been through mass processes of industrialization before, or big shifts in the relationship between labour and capital before because of technological change. But maybe this time is different because of the scale of it, because of the issues around automation, that basic tasks that we thought would never be accomplished by a computer can now be done by a computer. So it's a possibility that the scale of change might be radically different and that the power structures might be different. I think the fact that so much power is now in the hands of the platform economy in terms of Google and Facebook and Amazon and so on, that these companies which are basically unaccountable and aren't even paying the taxes they should be paying in the countries that they're based in. So maybe this time is different in terms of the scale of change.
Okay. By the way, Peter Felton's on, and he always helps people who've got any technical difficulties. So if you have any, type in the chat box on our webinar system. He will help you. As I said, we've got David Wood with us today from the London Futurists. So I'm going to hand over to you now, David.
Oh, welcome. So I think this is a fascinating and important topic. I'd like to follow up, Becky, with your thoughts on these platform companies that have more and more power. What do you think we should be doing about that? Should we be rejoicing in all the free services that we get, the remarkable free emails and free mapping and almost free music and free access to all kinds of information on YouTube? Should we be accepting that, or is there something different we should be doing as regards these great companies?
Well, we always say, well, it's not free because you're paying with your data. We just were talking earlier before we started the webinar, and I mentioned that I wasn't on Facebook. And the reason that I'm not on Facebook is because I don't want to give Facebook my data. So I don't think they are free. I think that's one of the mistakes that people make. You think, oh, they're free platforms, they're providing great services, but we're paying for these services with the kind of hordes of data that we're handing over to them. And I think one of our key concerns as people who are concerned with social democracy and those kind of values is that these companies are essentially seem to be unaccountable. So we saw that earlier this year when we were unable to get Mark Zuckerberg to appear in front of the UK Parliament to testify. And I think issues like that, when you have companies like Facebook, which we can see to be, partially responsible for interference in elections, for issues such as what went on in Myanmar with the genocide and so on and so forth, then I think they are very real concerns.
But what should we be doing about it rather than
what
being
should we be doing
concerned?
about them? I think we need to I think the public need to be educated. I think we might need to be looking at new models of governance. We need to be clamping down on them in terms of the tax regimes. I think a lot, it's funny because I started by talking about digital inequalities, and I think one of the issues, I think in ways that we could really tackle them is by educating people about how they are paying for these services, but they're paying for these platforms with their data. And I'm really surprised by how people's lack of awareness about the fact that actually you're handing over tons and tons of your user data in the same ways that when you're using your Nectar card in Sainsbury's, you're actually handing over tons and tons of really, really valuable marketing data. It's the same principle, really.
I mean, I noticed from the blurb on your blog and so on that you're really interested in the impact of these technologies on marginalised groups and also women as well. I mean, do you think these are suffering more from the changes in technology, and we have to, make special concentration on trying to deal with this? And what's the ethical implications of this?
Well, we see this panning out in lots of different ways. In terms of women globally are less likely to use the internet. So in developing countries, which is kind of I work in Development Studies Institute, women are kind of 50% less likely to have access to the internet than men in the same age group. And similarly, women are third less likely than men of similar age, education and economic status to access the internet via their phone. So overall, I think we can see an overall problem of gendered digital inequalities. So I think that is a real issue, and that affects, if you think about access to the internet and access to technology is vital for so many aspects of everyday life, from work to political voice to engaging with digital services. But this isn't just an issue in developing countries. My own research here in the UK, looking at low-income women's use of their phones, that often their use of technology was very much impacted by their experiences of gendered online violence. So women are using social media platforms, they're using technologies in which they are at risk of online violence and harassment, as we've seen with the case of female politicians who've been harassed on Twitter. We know that studies have shown in Europe that across Europe that women politicians are being kind of harassed off social media platforms. Do you think they're a very important space for political voice, and now their voices aren't being heard so much?
Okay, David, over to you.
Well, I'm very interested in the question that one of the viewers has raised, Terry Lone. He's suggesting that there is a way in which the change this time is different from in the past, which is that in the past, the well-off, the elites, were actually dependent on there being a reasonably healthy population to do things like work in factories or join the army and fight in wars. And so that the politicians in previous times who set up the welfare state and the NHS, you could argue they had enlightened self-interest at stake there because they needed the population. But now the suggestion is, and I've heard this from other thinkers as well, that more and more of us are useless, effectively. We can't contribute. The risk is that we will have little economic value to contribute because what we would have done can be obtained more readily from automation or possibly from workers overseas. Do you see that as a complicating factor, as something to be concerned about?
I think there's two issues here for me. Firstly, I think there's often a lot of, well, we know that there's often a lot of invisible labour in automation, and especially in machine learning. When you do those clicking a box to prove you're not a robot, the kind of little screen comes up and you're clicking on all the pictures where it says click all the pictures of a zebra crossing, and you're doing that kind of basic image detection work. That's work that you're working for Google there, and that's the kind of invisible labour. There's lots of people, there's thousands of people around the world who are being employed to do work like that, and often the work is actually much more distressing. The work might be kind of content moderation of extreme content on Facebook or on Twitter. There's a lot of invisible human labour which we just don't see. And the other invisible labour, which we don't talk about, was just made visible when my son ran into the room behind me, which is care work. That there's always going to be a need for care work, and the majority of that work is carried out by women, whether that's care work of children, or that's care work of elder people or people with additional needs. That care work isn't going to be automated, and arguably that care work is incredibly undervalued around the world and isn't included in GDP. But I think discussions about automation which ignore the enormous burden of care work and the fact that a lot of women's time is spent doing this work don't see the whole picture. And incidentally, in the chat box, someone just recommended the Shoshana Zuboff book about surveillance capitalism, and I'd endorse that read. I think it's very good.
We actually did 2 or 3 weeks ago a webinar on care work and automation. There's quite a lot of developments going on in that area, so it's not completely outside the circle. But on your other point about the fact that we're giving data to the big organizations whenever we tick that little robot box or whatever it is, and all the information we give. I mean, what are the ethical considerations around that? How can we deal with it? Who's going to, do we need a regulator? Do we need self-discipline? What's going to happen?
Oh, I think that's an absolutely vast question. And there's so many ethical bodies and so many industry bodies being set up to discuss this, and there's been various kind of government inquiries to look at this. But I think one of the things that we see as being really missing from these debates are the voices of the people who are most affected by it. So the people who are most affected by what we call algorithmic inequality. So people who've had, for example, kind of their benefits taken away because an algorithm has decided that they're no longer deserving of these benefits. I think the people who are the kind of victims of predictive policing and so on. I think one of the things that is really missing, there's a lot of heat and a lot of noise about the need for these kind of ethical considerations, and there's a lot of really good academic work and some really, really good policy work. But I do think the voices of the people who are most affected are really missing. And I also think there's a missing link that, and it comes back to this digital literacy and people having, ordinary members of the public, the man or woman on the street, just not really understanding the systems of control and decision making that are going on at the moment, that they're very, very opaque. So I think that's what needs to happen. I think kind of education about these digital systems and the systems of decision making and control, I think that's one of the most important things. And for politicians to get behind it as well. I think politicians typically haven't really understood issues of technology. There's not many politicians that you see in the UK Parliament that I would really trust to understand these kind of decisions. I think there's some really promising noises about politicians exploring issues like, should we have a basic income or a 4-day week to cope with the impacts of automation? But I think that these new the kind of changes in the political and civic space brought about by datafication and automation, I don't see politicians really kind of grasping that.
Okay, David?
You raised the point that some of the most valuable things happening in society were not captured in GDP.
Yeah.
You mentioned, for example, all the care work.
Yeah.
But I wonder, I mean, you talk about ethics. What should we be measuring, if not GDP? What are the things that should be in the forefront of all our minds and we should be feeling good or bad about if we can see these metrics changing?
I think two things just leap to mind. I'm not an expert on climate change, but I think anything that we are not, while we're not talking about climate change, we're kind of fiddling while Rome burns. That's what, I don't know, that seems to be maybe because but because I have got a 10-year-old son, and we've been talking a lot about the kids going out on strike on Friday, and this whole idea that, well, should we be skipping school, and is there any point in going to school when we're not even going to have a livable planet in 15 years? I think measuring issues to do, like I said, that's not my area of expertise, but including women's, I think there's been long debates in feminist economics circles about including care work in GDP somehow, and being able to kind of measure the amount of money that is saved by the global economy. It's in the trillions, isn't it, the amount of money that's saved by women doing unpaid domestic reproductive labour. And the fact that care work is very poorly paid as well, that when it is done, it's typically done by kind of low-paid women workers.
David, you wanted to come in?
So we shouldn't be celebrating, well, that we're saving lots of money by not paying people. We should, on the contrary, be highlighting other things like easy access to all important elements of a good life, and the expression of the diversities of opinion, as you mentioned, and also due attention to the externalities. One reason we've got climate change is the problem is we've only measured the value of the stock value of the oil companies, and when we're doing that, then we want them to be high. But if we think about the externalities, then we have different metrics.
I think thinking about externalities is a really brilliant way to capture some of the negative impacts of digitalization and automation as well. Because when you start thinking about the externalities of watching a video on YouTube and the amount of, I don't know, we saw this with Bitcoin, didn't we? That there was lots of slightly bogus statistics being flung around about the fact that all of the energy, I don't know if this is true or not, but it's a kind of illustration of how we could be thinking about it, that the savings in terms of climate change that have been made from solar panels have actually been wiped out by all the energy that have been used for mining Bitcoin. So it's starting to thinking about externalities and thinking about the real impacts of the kind of socio-technical systems that we live in is a really, really productive way of thinking.
The other thing I noticed from what you've written is that you've an interest in sustainable development goals. And I mean, do you think that AI and big data will help to create more global inequalities or less, even if you measure in non-GDP terms?
I think it's up to us. I think one of the problems with discussions about anything about technology, actually, that typically they suffer from what we call, in a kind of academic trade, technological determinism. That we say, oh well, we assume that we haven't got agency, we haven't got the power to do anything about it, although we haven't got any choice to do anything about it. And I'd kind of turn that question around and say, what can we do as communities? What can we do with the communities we live alongside in our workplaces, in our unions, in our churches? I think one of the interesting things when we've been researching this is looking at how these technological change is treated in different countries. So in Scandinavian countries, you have typically had this idea of a social dialogue, that when a technological change happens, that you should have a social dialogue between different stakeholders in society, between companies, between the private sector and trade unions and workers groups and all different groups in societies, that you don't just assume that technology is going to come along and you can't do anything about it. And I think that's one of the problems with discourses about technology. It's just like, oh, we can't do anything about it. And actually we can. We make choices about technologies the whole time. We make choices about, I don't know, investing in developing blockchain solutions rather than developing more effective, developing male contraception. There's a great, I always think that's a great illustration of the choices that we make about technologies. Is like, how much have we invested in developing brilliant new razors that could have been done in investing in the male pill? I don't know.
So when you're saying things like you've just been saying now,
Yeah.
Is that about, for example, digital advocacy and citizen involvement? Because you mentioned that in some of your work, and bringing groups, community groups, trade unions, and so on together. Is that your view of what digital advocacy should be?
I think it's about education as well. I mean, I think it's really interesting when you see what, in terms of primary age children, and I see this with my son going through primary school now, I think the importance of that, he's got to start with education about the digital systems that we are surrounded by. And like we were talking earlier about the fact that when you're on Facebook, like, you're handing over tons and tons of data, even when you're logged off from Facebook. And actually, even if you're not a Facebook user, they seem to be scooping up all this data. So I think there's an important bit of advocacy that's around education. And I think there's also an important bit of advocacy that's around telling our politicians that they have a duty of care, that we vote them in to take action on these big companies. And I mean, to be fair, I think they have tried. I think the House of Lords has really tried, and I was on a House of Lords committee on changed foreign policy in a digital world. So at a certain level, politicians do really engage, but I think it's up to us to tell the politicians and the people that represent us that the digital tools that we're using, that they've got a duty of care as part of the work that they do to make this technology work for us and not work for the faceless Silicon Valley boys.
Okay, David?
Are there any other political initiatives that you feel are worth supporting? You said earlier that many politicians don't seem to grasp the issues raised by new technologies, but perhaps there is some grounds for hope in some of the House of Lords activities. Do you see anything, or maybe overseas, in fact, are there legislators overseas that in some ways we can take inspiration from?
I think the discussions around the 4-day week, I think, are really, really exciting. I'm really pleased to see it being put onto the political agenda for a whole bunch of reasons, partly as a kind of solution, in inverted commas, to the inevitable job losses that will come with automation and digitization, but also because it's a double whammy. It deals with the care work issue as well, because if everybody's working 4 days a week, it makes the whole process of just organising childcare or organising elder care just a whole lot easier. And I just think in terms of quality of life, I think that's one of the policy measures that I think is really exciting. When we've been researching this, we've looked at various basic income experiments, or universal basic income experiments. One in India that seemed to have very, very positive outcomes, not just on things that you'd expect, like nutrition and health, but also in terms of gender equity. And there's a really interesting free to access book written by an academic called Guy Standing, which describes in great depth what happened when they did this experiment with basic income. So those are some of the policy initiatives that I think are particularly exciting, and also exploring new ways of taxing. I think the lawyers and the accountants coming up with new ways to kind of tax and regulate the digital economy, so it works for people. I think actually GDPR, I thought GDPR was really great actually, although it's anybody who works with data or works in a charity sector and has to kind of get all these new permissions from people before you email them. Actually, I think what GDPR shows is that actually you can regulate the digital economy. You can you get that governments can curtail these companies.
So, I mean, you said earlier that you're not on Facebook, so you've taken well, you are on Facebook now, but you've taken an individual decision, an individual act. You also talked about what the House of Commons does, the 4-day work, 4-day week, and so on. So, you know, whose responsibility is it to deal with this? Is it the state or is it the individual?
I think it's both. I think in terms of dealing with the impacts of automation, and the fact that we all need to be, that there's so much pressure on people to be, so with issues like delivering government services digitally and delivering anything from education digitally and so on and so forth, there's all this pressure now to kind of force people to be online. And actually we've got there's like 5 million people or so in the UK who are not internet users, who don't typically use the internet. And those patterns are repeated worldwide. So I don't think you can just say, oh, everybody has to be online or everyone has to get themselves digitally skilled. Actually, I do think it's the responsibility of the state to be delivering services in such a way that doesn't exclude people. There's people who don't go online, pay taxes too, and I think we should be ensuring that digital technologies are used not in such a way that doesn't exclude people, and that there isn't a kind of requirement for everybody to be online just to be able to engage with the state or to get education and so on and so forth.
Okay.
What about the counter argument to that, which says that it's an essential literacy skill these days?
Yeah.
Go back 100 years or 200 years, people didn't all need to read and write, but then people realized actually it is in everybody's interest to read and write. It helps them to take part. So shouldn't it be an important public initiative to ensure that everybody can be online and that there's a simple enough interface and a reliable enough interface for them to take part in at least key discussions and get key information about their rights and their responsibilities?
I think we can do that. And there used to be in the UK, I think I'm thinking of like 10, 15 years ago, a sort of state-led commitment through the Cabinet Office to address digital exclusion. And when I say state-led, I meant there was money for it. I was on the board of a digital exclusion charity down here in Brighton. So I think it's a question of equality of opportunity. I think people need to be given the opportunity to get those skills and to get that access. So I think one of the problems is, and I know from talking to people who work on these issues, especially around universal credit here in the UK, is that there are always going to be people who just don't have those skills and who don't have that access, because it's one of those, I know from my own research, that internet access is one of those services where the poor pay more. The poorer you are, the higher proportion of your income getting online is going to be. So I think I can see your argument that it's a cost saving for government and so on and so forth to help to deliver services digitally. But then I think if we're going to do that, I think we need a state commitment to providing affordable internet, to providing free skills training, to providing adequate support to the charities who work with the most kind of digitally left behind. And I'm afraid we just don't see that at the moment.
But, you know, if you're talking about, you know, public service delivery and digital equality, but isn't there another problem here, that if lots of services are beginning to be delivered digitally, they're going to be delivered by social enterprises, big companies, and not by the state? There's a conflict there. And how do we actually get a balance? How do we get some control and some regulation so that no one's left out and no one's making too much money and not too much data is being captured that we don't want captured?
Yeah, I think these are really, really difficult questions. And I think I think it really illustrates the fact that these new digital platforms are presenting problems that our existing political and social structures haven't matured to develop to sort of address yet, in the same way that our legal system hasn't matured to address the issues that of digitization yet. But I think whatever happens, we need to make sure that whatever services are being delivered, what essential services are being delivered, there's always an offline complement, that people aren't, there's always going to be the paper version for the person who just doesn't want to go get the messages on their mobile phone or get the emails. And I think that's a really important issue of kind of equity, actually, inequality.
Okay, I mean, we're getting very close to the end of the time. I mean, not too close, but we've got sort of 5 minutes or so. So we've got time for 2 or 3 more questions and points. So David, over to you again.
I'd like to feed in a question from Facebook, if I may. It's
See,
popped up on the screen.
I'm not on Facebook.
And I'm not sure who it's from, because it comes under the name Boris Prime. And he or she says, well, why don't you, Becky, get online, but with a false identity?
It's really hard.
And then you won't need to provide any information about yourself, but you'll still be able to keep an eye on what's happening on Facebook and connect in that way. So is that something you thought about?
Well, I used to cheat and use my husband's Facebook account. Yeah, it's something I have thought about, actually. And I've been off Facebook for like 5 or 6 years, and I think it's an interesting experiment in a way that you can see how much you lose out, how many the kind of social networks that you miss out on. But I think Facebook makes it really, really hard to do that. They have this kind of real name policy where actually it's really, really difficult to go on with the false name. So yeah, I have thought about it, definitely. And I did used to use my husband's account.
Okay, David, one more question and then we'll move on.
So, how strongly do you think we should be pushing for these initiatives like universal basic income or 4-day week? Are these just nice to haves, or do you think the whole of the public should be getting behind them and pushing hard for that to happen sooner rather than later?
I think the 4-day week, I think the public should really be getting behind it, because I think it's just so many wins. It's a win in terms of care work. It's a win in terms of basic quality of life. It's a win in terms of the environmental impact of having days, just less traffic on the roads and so on and so forth. So I think the 4-day week is something that I think we could really all get behind very powerfully.
Does that mean shops would only be open for less days?
Yeah, that's the difficult thing, isn't it? Yeah. So who gets to work the 4-day week? Well, that's something for us all to decide, isn't it?
But it's a good thing for us to spend our time thinking about, rather than some of the other stuff that's been occupying people's mind recently.
Yeah, and I think universal basic income. I mean, I think these things are possibly tied as well. I mean, we think one of the things that's really important about universal basic income is that we have a whole range of social protection and welfare systems in this country anyway. I mean, you get child benefit just for having a child in this country, so it's not like something that's completely alien to our culture and our society. So yeah, it's just if you think of it as an extension to existing kind of social protection mechanisms, it doesn't seem so exotic.
Okay, I got just one more substantive question, and that is, I mean, we're dealing with digital technology, which is not national, it's global.
Yeah.
So do you think there should be some sort of international code of ethics?
Well, with AI and so forth, I think it's really difficult because I think one of the issues is that we do have international codes of ethics, not ethics, and they are international human rights mechanisms. We have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and lots of international human rights law. And I think what we should be doing, instead of like making up lots more codes of ethics, is looking to the mechanisms that we do have, the conventions, the international conventions that we do have, and looking to see how businesses and individuals and states can be made to work within these existing mechanisms, like the right to freedom of expression, the rights to privacy, these universal rights that are enshrined in international law. So instead of the sort of reinventing the wheel, looking to those international mechanisms.
Okay, well, finally, if anybody wanted to know more about this or contact you or discuss it, how would they do that?
Well, obviously, although I'm not on Facebook, I am on Twitter. So I'm Becky_Faith on Twitter, BCKY_FAITH on Twitter. So you can follow me there and send me a message there.
Okay, well, thanks. That was really interesting. And if you're willing, we can do something again on this.
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah.
Because we covered such a wide area. And thank you, David, for helping, because you know so much about this topic and you can see through the wood and find the trees. So, you know, it's great. And I hope everyone enjoyed it. We've had a lot of comments, not the questions, actually, there've been comments on the side, which are really, really good. And it's always good when people do that. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for helping, David. And thank you, Becky, for doing this. And
thanks for some great questions.
Well, it's been a great webinar. So we'll end this interview now. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thanks to everybody as well.